Peter Barker, second mate on the Antelope, wrote in his introduction to his story of the shipwreck, quote, "However fatal and unfriendly the dreadful rocks around the Palau Islands may have proved to the navigators, it does not appear that anyone capable of relating his own misfortunes with sufficient accuracy to claim public attention ever before escaped from thence."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Goodwill of the Antelope?
Here we are. Enjoy!
British East India Company packet ship, the Antelope, of 300 tons, had departed from Falmouth on the 1st of September 1782, and had made stops in South America, New Guinea, and the Philippines before heading to Macau. On the 20th of July, 1783, the Antelope set sail from Macau to take the voyage home to England. She was sailing under the command of Captain Henry Wilson, with a crew of 50, including 16 sailors from China that they had added to their number for the return voyage due to being short-handed. Captain Wilson had chosen to make this voyage a family affair. His son was one of the midshipmen, and his brother was among the sailors. The Antelope would not be able to take the usual westward route from China due to an ongoing conflict between England and the Dutch having made that route a hostile one. Instead, they took the less used Eastern Passage. The Eastern Passage was intended to minimize exposure to monsoons, but it was soon clear to the people on board of the Antelope that they were in for a rough voyage full of bad weather. From the 23rd until the 8th, they met with a series of storms which were bad enough that even though all of the livestock had been secured in the face of the bad weather, all of the ship's cattle and one of the ship's goats did not survive the experience. The crew was also forced to go to the pumps every 2 hours, even though the Antelope was by no means an old or rotten ship. With the weather finally seeming to make a turn for the better on the 8th, the crew did their best to recover from the exhausting ordeal, and take stock of what provisions were still in good condition, as well as put the ship back into order. Unfortunately for the people on board, this proved to be a brief respite. It was after midnight on the 10th of August, when a new storm rolled in. Captain Wilson had left the deck at midnight in charge of Chief Mate Philip Benger, who ordered that the topsails be reefed, but did not see any real danger. There did not seem to be any reason to wake up the captain or call for the entire crew when the people who were part of his watch were able to do what was needed. And it seemed to Chief Mate Benger that what they were experiencing was a small passing storm. The crew was still occupied in reefing the sails when the lookout suddenly shouted that he saw breakers, but it was with such short notice that by the time the shout was heard on the deck, they were already striking the rocks ahead of them, with no chance of changing course. In taking the less used Eastern Passage, the ship had traveled too far east. Their reckoning of the ship's position had been off, possibly due to long periods of stormy weather. The crew that had been asleep, including Captain Wilson, were awoken as the ship shuddered and ground on the rocks that were sticking out from the breakers. Everyone on board rushed to the deck to see what could be done. Soon, the crew was gathered around Captain Wilson for direction, while Captain Wilson gave what orders he thought would benefit them in the long run. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that the ship was past repair. In less than an hour, the water had reached the lower deck hatchways. First order of business, therefore, was to collect everything below the decks that would be ruined by getting wet, including the gunpowder, weapons, and food. Once on deck, these items were still in danger of getting wet in the rain since they were still in a storm, and they had to shelter them the best they could. In the meantime, The masts were all cut away, since some of the motions that the ship was making on the rocks made the crew concerned that she might tip. With the weight of the masts gone, the danger was greatly reduced. Though they were now in less danger, the storm was gaining force, and there was a concern that the ship might be battered against the rocks and smashed to pieces. In response to this, the boats were lowered from the ship and provisioned, with 2 men in charge of them to keep them protected in the lee of the ship, just in case they would have to evacuate quickly. Having done everything they could, the crew now assembled in the stern of the ship, since it was the most sheltered, and Captain Wilson did what he could to reassure them. Food and wine were distributed to the crew as they rested, and they all waited for the morning so they could take a better stock of where they were. It was generally agreed that the crew behaved amazingly well in the circumstances, and everyone had done as Captain Wilson requested, including avoiding inebriation, which, he pointed out, had brought ruin to other shipwrecked crews. Dawn allowed them to see the small island to the south, and several others to the east. There was some concern amongst the crew about the reception they might meet on the islands if they were populated, but since it was not likely that they were going to be able to remain for long on the wrecked Antelope, they had no choice but to send the boats to go investigate. This task fell to Chief Mate Banger, who was urged to avoid disagreement with any of the local population he might come across, if at all possible. It would be better if he could establish a friendship. With these orders, Chief Mate Banger departed, and the rest of the crew set about making rafts, so that they would be able to escape if the ship went to pieces as feared, while they all waited anxiously for Chief Mate Banger to return. Chief Mate Banger returned with good news. They had found no people on the island, but they had found a safe landing spot, and they had already landed all of the provisions that had been on the boats and left some men to guard them. It was an account to fill everyone with hope, and everyone returned to building rafts, now with the destination in mind. It was during this time that it was found that the mizzenmast had been tangled up near the ship's stern after being thrown overboard. Godfrey Minks, the ship's deputy quartermaster, went to work trying to free it, but in the process he slipped overboard. Boats were lowered to try to save him, but it was too late. He sank like a rock, and it was supposed by the second mate that it was due to him having put on far too many items of clothes. He would be the only casualty of the wreck. Captain Wilson was determined to have the crew on shore before darkness fell, especially since the seas were still stormy, but most of the crew was determined to gather as many goods as possible before they left. This meant that even after the raft, jollyboat, and pinnace were all loaded with as many goods as they could safely carry, while also carrying the crew continued to bring items to the deck stubbornly. The boatswain was finally forced to whistle for all hands on deck before most of them came up and began to be loaded into the waiting vessels. The carpenter in particular was reluctant to leave behind any of his tools or stores, because he was worried they might need them on shore, and he was left behind when the raft departed, towed by the pinnace. It was not until the jollyboat was about to depart that Captain Wilson had ordered that he leave the ship with them or be left behind. The people on the raft, being towed by the pinnace, had the worst passage by far. In the stormy seas, it took them an hour to cross the reef, and the entire time, the waves crashed over them with enough force that the men on the raft were forced to tie themselves down. Much of the time, the swell was so high that they could not even see the pinnace that they were tied to. Eventually, they were forced to give up the raft and supplies on it and bring the people from the raft into the pinnace. They, as well as the jollyboat, arrived at the spot that Chief Mate Banger had selected around 8 at night. They found that the men who had been left to guard the supplies had already done good work of setting up a camp, having cleared a spot to store supplies, and set up a sailcloth tent for them to sleep in. It was a welcome sight, with a fire to dry their clothes, but it led to an anxiety-filled night. All through the night, the storm continued, and since the tent was not large enough for everyone, they were forced to sleep in shifts, while the rest did their best to keep warm and dry while standing in the elements. There was a lot of anxiety through the night that the storm might destroy the ship while they were on land, and they would not be able to get everything out of it that they needed. The next morning they found the raft and tried again to tow it, but with the wind speed still very high, they were forced to abandon the raft, though they did remove the supplies from it. Having done that, the two boats headed to the wreck and gathered more provisions before returning to the camp. There had still been some hopes among the crew that somehow they would be able to save the Antelope and sail back to England. But the men in the boats came back with the news that the ship, while still in one piece, was past all saving, and the crew spent a second miserable and stormy night accompanied with this gloomy thought. To make matters worse, the next day was too stormy for the boats to return to the wreck and gather any more materials. They were confined to the shore, therefore, and were working on building better shelters, when two canoes were spotted approaching them. The first response of the crew was to reach for weapons, but Captain Wilson told them to put them away, not wanting to start things out on an aggressive note. With only 8 people in 2 canoes approaching, he also did not think the people coming could be considered much of a threat, even if they did prove to be hostile. Instead of meeting the people in canoes with weapons, Thomas Rose, who was the ship's translator, stepped forward and spoke to the people in the canoes in Malay. This was a smart choice since, while there were no records of any European vessels ever having visited the Palau Islands where they wrecked, there was a Malay-speaking Chinese trading vessel that had wrecked near there previously. Thomas Rose's guess proved to be an accurate one, and they soon had a response from one of the men in the same language, though it was not the language the men spoke amongst themselves. At Captain Wilson's request, Rose told the men in the canoes that they were friendly, and the men came on shore, though they were still clearly wary of the strangers. In spite of their suspicions, they accepted the offers of tea and sweet biscuits when they were offered, and Rose and the men who had responded to him in Malay were able to have a conversation. It turned out that the men who spoke Malay also spoke some Dutch and a few words of English. He had been the captain of the Chinese vessel that had wrecked, and had also been cast away and had found his way to the Palau Islands, where he had been welcomed by the local king. The remains of the Antelope had been spotted already by a canoe that was fishing, and they had reported it to the king, who had dispatched the people who were now before them to investigate. Among the group of men, it turned out, were 2 of the king's brothers. After about an hour, the 2 groups had dropped any suspicion of each other, and it was decided that Captain Wilson's brother should go with the men in one of the canoes to meet with the king and explain their situation, while some of the men in the canoes declared their intention to remain with the castaways to help them salvage what supplies they could from the Antelope. This was also partly out of concern that they might meet with other canoes who would not be aware that the group from the Antelope was friendly. The group was thus divided, with the younger brother of the king returning to report on their findings, accompanied by Matthias Wilson, while the older brother, who also acted as a general, remained in the camp with some men to help where he could. The sailors were amazed to find that the man who acted both as prince and general was more than happy to help with any chores that needed to be done, and he took an active interest in everything around him. Of particular interest were the guns, which were discovered in spite of Captain Wilson's desire that they remain hidden in case they were seen as a threat. It was soon apparent that they would not have been deemed a threat, since their operation had to be explained to their guests. There was also a joy found in the ship's dogs, which had been brought to shore since these were also something not found on the islands. The cultural exchange continued for the 2 days it took for Matthias Wilson to return, this time with another brother of the king, and one of the king's sons. Matthias Wilson returned with the news that the gifts that he had brought with him for King Abul had been well received, and that he had been treated with the greatest of hospitality. He had been anxious during his first night since he was surrounded by people whose language he did not speak and whose customs he did not understand, but he had only been treated with kindness. He also returned with permission from King Abul for them to either build a new vessel out of the remains of the Antelope, or for them to move into his community as they pleased. Not only that, but if they did decide to build a ship, he assured them that they would have as much assistance with the project as he could offer. The men who had been shipwrecked were not willing to remain so far from home, no matter how much they were welcome, and so they began in earnest to strip everything from the Antelope to build a ship to take them to China. Unfortunately for the people who had been shipwrecked, now the local population also knew about the shipwreck and began to strip it of the things that they needed. Arakukar, one of the king's brothers, tried to prevent this, but it was impossible to keep everyone away. Captain Wilson therefore got his permission to station armed sentries on the ship. Captain Wilson made sure that Arakukar understood what was being asked by giving him a demonstration of the guns firing. Captain Wilson was also forced to make a proposal to the crew that he did not think would be well received. He wanted to dump all of the spirits from the ship into the sea out of fear that either the crew or the local population would drink it and might cause trouble. Captain Wilson was aware that, with the Antelope wrecked, he technically no longer had any authority other than the goodwill of his men, and therefore was very gratified when the suggestion was universally agreed to. A few days after the crew from the Antelope had landed, they were visited by King Abul himself, who arrived with many canoes, including one full of armed men, but who was considerate enough to order the canoes with armed men to remain far away to make it clear this was a diplomatic visit. He accepted that the crew wanted to build a ship, but still suggested that they depart from the island that they called Orulong. It was considered an unhealthy island, which is why it was not inhabited. Captain Wilson expressed his confidence in his ship's doctor, however, and did not think it was convenient to be further away from the wreckage of the Antelope. King Abul spent the night in a camp with his men, and when the crew of the Antelope went to visit him the next morning, they found him in a very serious mood. At first they were worried that they had offended him, but instead they found that he had been talking to Arakukar and had been told about the guns. They were at war with some neighboring islands, and thought that even 5 men armed with muskets could make all the difference. Captain Wilson, overjoyed to be able to be of some assistance to the ruler who was giving them so much help, readily agreed. King Abul also proved entirely correct. The show of force from the muskets ended the dispute between the islands quickly, and the king was so overjoyed that he provided the camp of castaways with every delicacy he could offer as a show of his thanks. He also sent his brother Rakuk to tell Captain Wilson that as an additional show of thanks, they could have the island of Orulong, and as a result, Captain Wilson had a British flag hoisted on the island. It was said by later visitors that the population continued to refer to it as Englishman's Island for some time. It was in this same tone that the exchange between the two groups continued. Captain Wilson sometimes visited the king, and sometimes the king visited them. The king sent men to help them build their ship, and when it was completed, had it painted for them. In exchange, several more times men from the Antelope were sent with the king to help with skirmishes with other islands, all of which were quickly won with the help of the muskets. On November 9th, the new vessel, which was named the Orulong after the island they were on, was completed, and King Abul and many of his people came to the launching ceremony. Since they had been met with such hospitality for several months, Captain Wilson gave to King Abul as many tools as they could spare, as well as 5 muskets, 5 cutlasses, half a barrel of gunpowder, gun flints, and bullets. To this, Captain Wilson also gave his personal fowling piece to King Abul as a gift, which the king particularly treasured. There was one final exchange made. King Abul made the request that they bring with them his second son Li Bu, a man of about 20 years of age. He acknowledged that the voyage was likely to be dangerous, and that there was a chance that he would never see his son again, but he thought it would be best for his son to travel with them, and that things were likely to be equally dangerous if his son remained at home. Li Bu, therefore, was given to the care of Captain Wilson, who agreed to treat him as his own son. Meanwhile, one of the sailors, named Blanchard, had decided that he would be much more comfortable if he remained in the Palau Islands, and Captain Wilson gave him as many supplies as he could spare for his comfort, including a compass and the mast and sails from the pinnace. With this, the Orulong departed with one last shower of gifts and tearful goodbyes, since they had made many friends. Ra Cook traveled with them the longest before departing, and as a final show of their friendship, Captain Wilson gave him a pair of pistols with a cartridge box. Once the Orulong reached Macau, they found that there were no English vessels, though some Portuguese ships that discovered them to be castaways provided them with supplies. Captain Wilson did have a friend in Macau, however, who was able to help them, and they got word to the company agents in Canton, who sent them warm clothing and enough money to find passage home. Since there were no ships available that could take everyone, the crew was split up. Captain Wilson spent his voyage home, since he was just a passenger, teaching Li Bu how to speak English and how to read. Captain Wilson kept his word to treat Li Bu as his own son, and he welcomed him into his family's home and began to show him around. He avoided theaters and other crowded places, though, because he was worried about smallpox. He intended to get Li Bu inoculated against it, but did not want to do so until Li Bu could understand enough English to understand what was being done to him. Unfortunately, this decision would have tragic results. On December 16th, Li Bu showed signs of the illness as Captain Wilson had feared. Though the members of the crew who had befriended him rushed to his side and nursed him as best they could, he passed away on the 27th of December. The British East India Company paid for his funeral as a thanks to the kindness their crew had met with from King Abul. They also sent a large amount of livestock, weapons, and hardware to the king as recognition for all that he had done. Blanchard would also meet with misfortune not long after he decided to remain in Palau. It was reported that he had passed away in a battle with another island. The many accounts of kindness that the crew of the Antelope reported on having met with from the population of Palau meant that soon other ships were making stops there. It was soon reported that other crews had not met with such kindness, and it was discovered by the crew of the Antelope that this was due to the crews of some whaling vessels having not behaved themselves well. The relationship of mutual respect and interest that had existed between King Abul and Captain Wilson was no more.
For more information, please see The Interesting History of Prince Li Bu, published in 1800, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.